Hey friends, Elizabeth here from Plant-Based Bride, back again with another video. And today I'm excited to share with you all the books I read in January and also my plans for reading for February. As you can tell, this is a long video. I did read 18 books in January, though one of those was a reread, so I read one book twice. But still, I read a lot in January. It's going to take me a while to get through all of them, no matter how concise or succinct I try to be. So stick with me. As always, I'll have all of the timestamps in the description box, so you should be able to hover over the timeline of your player and see what books I'm talking about when, if you want to jump around, if there's some books that you're not interested in, or if you just want to support me and give me that sweet, sweet watch time. Feel free to watch from beginning to end. You can always speed up this video to 1.25 times speed or 1.5 times speed if you are so inclined. Let's jump into the books I read in January because we have a lot to get through. So if you saw my December wrap-up video and my January TBR, you will know that for January, my challenge to myself was to try to read as many of the winners of the 2020 Goodreads Choice Awards as I could. So that is part of the reason why I read so much in January. I was really pushing myself to try to get through all the winners. I did not succeed. I did not read every single winner, but I did my best. And I did also read a couple other books that had nothing to do with my challenge just because I couldn't help myself. And apparently I needed to read more in January for some reason. So I'm going to start by going through the Goodreads Choice Award winners for 2020, and I'm going to go through them in the order that they're on the Goodreads website, so that if you're at home and trying to go through this with me, maybe see which ones you want to add to your own TBR or to any of your own shelves, you can do that along with me, and it's just in the same order. Easy to follow along. The interactive element of this video. And then once I've talked about all the winners, I'll also add in those couple other books that I read that were not part of this challenge. So let's get into it. The first winner with almost 73,000 votes in the fiction category was The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. And not only was this a book that I was picking up because it was part of this challenge, it was one of the winners, but it was also our January pick for my book club over on Patreon. So it did double duty, and this is actually the book I read twice this month. So I ended up rereading it in ebook format so I could more easily highlight sections and write down quotes and formulate discussion questions for our discussion for the book club. The focus of this book is on depression and suicidal ideation, so this is a trigger warning for the discussion of this book as well, because it is such a primary feature of what this book is trying to say. So I'll put the book card up for this one now so you can see all the trigger warnings that I could think of to add, and my discussion of it here is also going to include some discussion of specifically depression, suicidal ideation, and attempted suicide. The Midnight Library focuses on Nora, who is a woman with severe depression, long-standing depression, who has a string of not so great things happen to her in a short period of time that push her to that breaking point where she makes the decision that the world would be better off without her, and she attempts suicide. But she discovers that between life and death, there is a library with shelves that go on forever and books that contain the infinite possibilities of her life, as well as a librarian who's ready to show her the way. So I loved this one and I gave it 5 stars. As someone who's suffered from depression myself and loved people whose lives have been repeatedly touched by suicide, this book really hit close to home and I felt very moved by it, to tears many times. And I can relate to having, that book of regrets of choices that you wish you'd made slightly differently or at a different time, or different lives that you thought you were going to be able to lead or you wanted to be able to lead that didn't come to fruition, and dwelling on that. And I do think that the vast majority of us who have suffered from depression know that feeling very well. It is sort of a hallmark of depression, is living in the past and thinking of what ifs and comparing how our lives turned out to our romanticized imaginations of what it could have been, what we believe our potential was that we don't think we lived up to. So this was really relatable to me. And while I feel incredibly grateful and lucky to live the life I live now, I was in a very different place in my early 20s. And this past decade has been a decade of growth and discovery and kind of carving out what I want my life to be. While I have never struggled with suicidal ideation myself, I was in a very dark place in my early 20s, and I could really, really see that version of myself in Nora. This book explores really difficult topics and topics that a lot of people, even those of us who have faced them ourselves, sort of draw away from. I think it's common for us to kind of recoil from the experience of depression because it is depressing to be in the shoes of someone with depression. It's not a rosy experience. It's not fun. But I do think it's important for both those of us who do struggle with depression to see ourselves represented in the literature we read, not just as a stereotype or as a side character, but also for those who don't experience depression to maybe get a peek behind the curtain of what it might be like and how it might come to be, and maybe be able to find more empathy for those in their lives who may be struggling, because it's a difficult thing to understand if you've never experienced it. This book tackled these issues with a lot of clarity and hope and had so many nuggets of wisdom. I highlighted large swaths of text as I was rereading this one, and I appreciated that it ended with a sense of hope. This does not have a tragic ending, and so many fictional stories about people with depression who struggle with suicidal ideation end in tragedy. And it was really nice to have that expectation subverted here. That's not to say it's a perfect ending or that all of her problems have magically disappeared. It's not that kind of fantasy, but there is hope, and I appreciated that. We had some really interesting conversations in our book club discussion about the nature of memory and expectations, the whole grass is always greener sort of mindset, or romanticizing the paths we didn't take. And even on a deeper level, what our definitions are of a good or a purposeful life, a life well lived. What does that mean? And how can we define it for ourselves? Because everyone's definition is going to be different. And then once we define it, how do we make that our reality? Anyway, as you can see, I was very moved by this. I have a lot of thoughts and feelings about it. I thought it was beautifully done. I really resonated with it. And I can see myself reading it for a third time and maybe more after that in the future. All that to say, I definitely think this book deserves the win in this fiction category. Now take that with a grain of salt because I've only read 2 of the other nominees, one of which was a winner in another category, so I'll be talking about it later, which is Such a Fun Age by Kiley Reid. And the other one was Migrations by Charlotte McConaughey, which was not my favorite. I gave it 3 stars, I believe. It was okay, but not for me. So from my limited perspective, I'm happy that The Midnight Library was the winner. I promise I'm not going to talk for that long about all of them. I feel like that one, because it resonated so much with me and it was our book club discussion book and I read it twice, I had more to say. But I promise I will do my best to be more concise for the rest of these. Okay, so the next winner from Goodreads is the mystery thriller winner, and the winner is actually a book I read back in October of 2020, which is The Guest List by Lucy Foley. And this one is kind of, it feels like it's based on sort of an Agatha Christie style mystery. A bunch of people have been brought to this isolated island for a wedding, and then nefarious things happen, and we have to figure out who did it. It's that classic whodunit. And as you'll know, if you've been watching these videos for a while and you saw the one that I posted with my wrap up for October, you will know that I didn't enjoy this one. Unfortunately, I gave it 2 stars. It just wasn't for me. I'm not going to get into too many details with the guest list because I've already talked about it. I'll link the video where I go into it more in the description box if you want to watch it. I just found it predictable. I found the characters very off-putting and not in a particularly interesting way. It just didn't really grab me. Definitely not my favorite. And I have read a couple of the other books that were nominated for the mystery thriller category. So I've also read Home Before Dark by Riley Sager, When No One Was Watching by Alyssa Cole, One by One by Ruth Ware, and The Night Swim by Megan Goldin. So of those, I did not like The Night Swim or One by One. And then When No One Is Watching, I enjoyed, but I did have some issues with it, primarily pacing and then the twist at the end. So that one got 3 stars. And then Home Before Dark still wasn't a perfect book by any means, but it was my favorite of the ones I've read that are on this list. I gave it 4 stars. Home Before Dark would have been my pick for this category from the books that I have actually read. On to our next category, which is historical fiction. The winner with 102,626 votes, this is the most votes so far, was The Vanishing Half by Brit Bennett. And I loved this one. This is the story of twin sisters who are light-skinned African-American girls who grow up in a town that is completely made up of light-skinned Black people. And this town and the people within it are extremely colorist. And we have these twin girls who are identical, who end up leaving their small town, going into the wide world and choosing very different paths for themselves. One marries a dark-skinned man and has a dark-skinned daughter and ends up returning to her town and experiencing the different treatment that she receives as the now mother of a dark-skinned girl, while the other sheds her past life, leaves her identity behind to pass as a white woman, marry a white man, and have a daughter who also passes for white and doesn't know her racial makeup. And this follows their lives from when they're young through their adulthood as they choose their different paths, and even moves on to their daughters who end up meeting and have no idea that they're cousins. And I gave The Vanishing Half 5 stars. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. It was so well done. The use of the identical twins choosing such different paths is just such a clever way to identify the differences between how we're treated, not even based on our actual race, but just others' perceptions of our race. This novel explores family, community, colorism, racism, class, bigotry, and belonging in such a nuanced way, with characters that jump off the page and I came to feel so connected to. There's diversity and representation here, with one of the characters dating a trans man whose experiences are explored in some detail, including his struggles with gender dysphoria and his comfort around his body being seen and touched by his partner, which I thought was handled in a really thoughtful and caring and conscientious way. And that character is one of my favorites. But just overall, such a thought-provoking read, incredibly engrossing. I was really pulled into it. And the world building was also really well done, from the rural town through to more metropolitan settings, and over the course of decades, how things shifted. Just so well done. I highly recommend it. And I definitely think it deserved to win in this category, even though I have not read any of the other nominations. So I guess I can't really say that. I have nothing else to compare it to from within the category, but it was fantastic and it definitely deserves all the attention and praise that it's getting. And our next category, if you follow me on Goodreads, you've been spoiled. You already know what I think of all these books, but you certainly know my thoughts on this one because this is the fantasy category, adult fantasy, and the winner with 95,000 plus votes was House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J. Maas. This is the first foray into adult fiction by Sarah J. Maas, who is known for her young adult fantasy that is very popular. I have read both of her most popular series. I read them when I was in my early 20s, and I thought they were fine. They were readable. I read the whole series, so that indicates something, but they also weren't my favorite. Now fast forward to today as a 28-year-old, and I did not want to read this, I have to admit. First of all, it's really long. This book is ridiculously long. It's almost 1,000 pages. Does it need to be almost 1,000 pages? No, it does not, but it is. And I really didn't want to subject myself to that. But in an effort to make this video more complete, I felt I would be remiss if I didn't try. So I got the audiobook and I tried. This is an urban fantasy that I guess if I had to define the plot in a simple way, it is our main character has someone close to them murdered, and they spend the rest of the book trying to figure out who murdered them and why, basically. And there's angels and fauns and shapeshifters, werewolves, fae, all kinds of species chucked in there together, and it's a technologically advanced world where they have cell phones and TV. And it's supposed to be adult fantasy, so there's a lot of swearing and sexual content, and there's drugs and alcohol, partying. It's gritty. I know a lot of people love Sarah J. Maas. I know a lot of people love this book, clearly. And that's fine. You're allowed to love whatever you love. I am so happy that you enjoyed it and didn't feel cheated by being forced to be part of this world for so long, but I did not. So I'm going to rant about it a little bit. If you would rather not have your soul crushed today, which I mean, I get it. Feel free to skip to the next book. I will not be offended. I don't want to offend you with my opinions, but I also am going to be honest. So just putting that out there. So I have many issues with this, and if you want them in detail, check out my Goodreads review because I wrote a very long review and I went through them point by point. But there are a few things that I feel I have to mention in this video. So the first thing is that this is not adult fantasy. It is labeled as adult fantasy. It's been priced as adult fantasy. It's not adult fantasy. This is a YA novel. It just is. It is not significantly different from her style with her past work. The only difference is that there is a lot of swearing in a very unnatural, stilted way. I compared it in my Goodreads review to when you're 14 and you finally get comfortable with saying a couple swear words and you use them every other word when you're around your friends because it makes you feel cool and it's taboo and you feel gritty and adult because you use so many swear words. That's how it's written, and it's very irritating. There's also no cohesion in this world. There are so many different species thrown in. It seemingly just because she can, and there's nothing holding them together. There's no exploration of different cultures and how they interact. There's not really any exploration of tensions between different species or different ways that they maybe approach the world. And the technological aspect is really thrown in there haphazardly and feels at odds to the structure of the world, which does feel a lot more similar to her past works that are set pre-technological revolution. It feels disjointed because it doesn't make sense that their society would continue to function in the way that it does with so much technology available, because technology does in fact impact how societies function, surprisingly enough. The writing is very juvenile. The word alpha hole, which should never exist. I wish I could scrub my brain so that I could forget that anyone ever used this unironically. Alpha hole, really? It's used so many times. It is embarrassing, to be honest. Literal physical cringe while listening for the vast majority of this incredibly unnecessarily long book. The pacing of this is a mess. It needed to be edited down significantly. It could have been cut in half easily without losing anything. Actually, it would have been a gain, at least in my own sanity. If you have to say that it gets better after page 500, this book was not ready to be published. You cannot force people to suffer through 500 pages to get to the good part. And listen, the good part was not good enough to make up for the 500 first pages, I assure you. I don't know how many of you are on Reddit, and of those, how many of you know the Men Writing Women subreddit, but it's a subreddit where people post examples of male authors writing female characters or writing about women in a very sexist, male gaze kind of way, to the point where it's ridiculous. And that's what this book is. This book is written so heavily from the male gaze. It's incredibly uncomfortable and very objectifying, and I did not appreciate reading it as a woman myself. The main character's behind is described in every way imaginable in every single scene she's in. Our main character cannot be in a scene without someone looking at, describing, referring to, admiring her rear end, and it's so unnecessary. Why is our main character reduced to a body for most of the novel? Can someone tell me? I do not want to read a main character who's objectified, regardless of their gender. It's so unnecessary. And to see people claiming that this is a feminist fantasy is baffling to me. It makes no sense. Though our main character is not the only one who's objectified, many characters are objectified, including the main love interest, who is often referred to by how muscly he is. There is one particular quote, which I included in my Goodreads review, that I'm going to include here because I felt my last brain cell dying when I heard it in the audiobook. Do you want to hear it? Here it is. But she didn't give a shit about his dental hygiene when he looked like that. Muscles upon muscles upon muscles. I don't even know where to start unpacking that. Okay, let's all support dental hygiene and not write sentences like that ever again. So there's more that I could talk about, including the fact that none of the characters were likable except for one who ended up sacrificing themselves for our main character. So that's great. Or the fact that there's a weird reverence towards police officers and the oppressors in this society, and blaming the oppressed group and framing them as terrorists when they try to fight for their rights and freedoms, which is really messed up and needs to be talked about more, because this is not okay. And I can't believe that that was such a strong message behind this book and that it's not being talked about by every single review. The main character is a classic, Sarah J. Maas, chosen one, best at everything, most sexy, most intelligent, most badass, wanted by everyone, basically a god, which is unsurprisingly very uninteresting to read. And the last thing I'm going to bring up, because I think it's very important, I would definitely recommend seeking out Own Voices reviewers on this point. But the way that the people of color and queer characters were represented in this did not do it for me. It felt very much like tokenism and was questionable at best. So when you combine that with the atrocious dialogue and awful pacing and bloated descriptions that don't actually tell you anything about the world, the one-dimensional characters, the weird forced romance, the slut-shaming and objectification, this book was a total mess, and I wish I'd never read it. So I normally don't rant about books because I try to give books the benefit of the doubt, even if it doesn't work for me, but let's put it this way. I read this halfway through January, and I can't see any other book that I read in 2021 being worse than this. So that's where we're at. I realize this is the beginning of the series. You could not pay me enough to read the next one unless I'm really feeling a bout of masochism at the time. It's not going to happen. If it wasn't clear, I don't recommend. 1 star. So as for my thoughts on whether I think this deserved the win, I think my opinion's probably pretty clear at this point, but no, I do not. I have only read 2 of the other nominees at this point. The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab, which was the runner-up, and then Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue only lost out by a couple thousand votes. It was pretty close up there. I really enjoyed both The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue and Black Sun, but I did enjoy The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue just a little bit more. And I know Addie LaRue is hit or miss for people. Some people hate it, some people love it. I loved it. I gave it 5 stars, so it would have been my pick, and it was my pick. I voted for it. Anyways, next category is romance. The winner is From Blood and Ash by Jennifer L. Armentrout. I did not read this one. It was at the end of my list of ones that I was interested in. As y'all know, I don't read a lot of romance. It's not my favorite genre, so I was hoping I could get to it, but I wasn't prioritizing it, and I requested it from my library. I ended up not getting it in time, so I didn't read it. Though I will say one of the nominations on this list is probably my favorite romance I've ever read, which is Boyfriend Material by Alexis Hall. So that would have been my pick. It is the one that I voted for, and I would highly recommend it if you haven't read it. Also, if you've read From Blood and Ash and you enjoyed it, let me know your thoughts. Do you think I would like it? Let me know. Okay, so the next category is science fiction, which, as y'all know, is one of my favorite genres of books to read. I love science fiction. And the winner was To Sleep in a Sea of Stars by Chris Paolini. And this is about a xenobiologist who is on a planet as part of a team that are doing research there. And she stumbles upon a cavern with an ancient alien relic. And something happens. The plot takes off from there. There are alien species fighting humans. There's quite a bit of space battles going on. And I thought this one was okay. I ended up giving it 3 stars. If not for a single character who I'll talk about in a minute, it would have been a 2-star read, unfortunately. I say unfortunately because I love sci-fi and I want to enjoy all the sci-fi I read. Well, I want to enjoy every book I read, to be honest, but I was looking forward to this one. I wanted to like it. But while the beginning was great, the first few chapters with our main character finding this ancient alien relic and The discovery of the Xeno and how that incorporates into the story and what happens shortly thereafter was fascinating. It was exciting. I was so drawn in. I was so intrigued. I wanted to know what the Xeno was, what it did, why it was there. Was it sentient? I needed all the answers. And sadly, from those first couple chapters, things just sort of went downhill from there. Not to an awful degree, but just everything that came after the beginning wasn't as interesting as the beginning, which just isn't really what you want from a book, unfortunately. The answers we got about the Xeno, in my opinion, were not particularly satisfying nor particularly interesting. The further we went along, the more I started to see issues with the pacing. This is another one that is way too long and could have easily been cut in half. There were issues with the dialogue. Again, there was stilted dialogue here. There's this weird convention Paolini was stuck on where most of the time the characters would start their line by saying, Elizabeth here, and then say what they were saying, and then the next person would respond and say, other person here, blah, blah, blah. It got so irritating. I don't even know how to tell you how frustrated I was by that. It continued on, and it wasn't just in sort of military situations or within a battle where you maybe expect people to identify themselves before speaking because maybe they're on a radio and you want to make sure you know who's talking. There were certain species who every time they spoke, no matter what the setting, no matter how casual and chill the situation was, they still talked like this back and forth for long scenes of dialogue. It was maddening. Also, the use of the word also. So many sentences in this book ended with also. I couldn't tell you why. I started noticing it near the beginning and it felt like it got worse throughout, and it was very glaring and distracting. So, also the characters, not the most well-developed, unfortunately. The main character was pretty much a blank slate, not very interesting outside of what's happening to her. There were a few of the secondary characters that were more interesting, but we really didn't get a lot of time with them to develop them further. The only character that I felt any kind of attachment to was Grigorovich, who was their shipmind, essentially a human who has had their body removed so that their brain can continue to evolve and grow and expand. And then they are installed in a ship and they basically run the ship. And the shipmind on the ship that they're on for the majority of this book is Grigorovich, and he is glorious. I loved him so much. He is very eccentric. He calls all of the people on the ship meatbags, but he'll add some spice and variety depending on which one he's talking about to distinguish them. So he loves to call our MC, oh, spiky meatbag, which is just 10 out of 10. I would let Grigorovich call me a spiky meatbag any old time. He was fantastic. If the sequel's all about Grigorovich, I'll read it. If not, there's no chance. So my love of Grigorovich is the only reason this book got 3 stars instead of 2. There was just a lot here that didn't work for me. The ham-fisted romance between the MC and the roguish captain of the ship with a ragtag crew. Saw it coming, didn't have any heart, wasn't necessary. The pacing, as I mentioned, was way off. This book was way too long. Huge amounts of time spent in cryo, traveling long distances in space, which is actually something I'm interested in, but the way that it was done became very repetitive, and then just excessive amounts of space battles that ended up blending together. I actually skimmed through the last biggest battle because I was so bored of these space battles with the same aliens at that point in the book that I just didn't care, and I got to the end of it, and it didn't matter that I skimmed it because it didn't have any impact on what happened afterwards anyways. And I don't want to get into spoilers, but I will say that this had too many fantastical elements in it for me for it to be a true sci-fi. And it kind of felt like a cop-out where instead of having a really interesting scientific explanation for certain things, it was just, they are basically a god. That's why. There we go. It's magic, which was frustrating to read. And there was some bullying that came along with victim blaming of the one who was bullied, which really sucked to read, and some weird, essentially body shaming of a character with scars, which I also didn't appreciate reading. I just think that this wasn't the book for me, and I think it could have used a whole heck of a lot more editing before going to print. I still gave it 3 stars. As I said, I loved Grigorovich. And then the other 2 stars are because I found the premise really interesting. I was really hooked at the beginning. And I just enjoyed getting to be in space for the duration of this. I liked little snippets of some of the secondary characters, but it really wasn't enough for me. I just wasn't invested and was unsatisfied by the ending. It just kind of was done. And it felt like it was setting up for a sequel, though I don't see information about that anywhere. So I don't plan on reading the sequel if there is one, as I mentioned, unless it is all about Grigorovich all the time. So that's that one. Out of the other nominees, I have read Riot Baby by Toshi Onyebushi, and I also read Hench by Natalie Zena Walshots. And out of those two, I preferred Riot Baby. Okay, our next category is horror, and the winner for horror with 85,000 plus votes was Mexican Gothic by Sylvia Moreno-Garcia. And this is one that was on my TBR for months, and I was so excited to read it. And I think maybe I fell victim to the hype because unfortunately it didn't live up to it for me. So this novel focuses on a well-off young woman living in Mexico, and her father gets a letter from her cousin who has recently gotten married and moved away. And the letter is incredibly concerning. She's talking about hearing voices in the walls and seems to be worried for her safety. So Naomi's father sends her to go visit her cousin and make sure that she's okay and try to convince her cousin's new husband that she should be getting some psychiatric help. And she gets there and the story continues. I loved the beginning of this. I thought the setup was great. I was immediately intrigued, similar to Sleep in a Sea of Stars. And in a similar manner, as it continued on, it just kind of lost its momentum. I lost interest, and the reveals didn't do it for me. This is another one that suffered from awkward, stilted dialogue. I don't know what it is about the Goodreads Choice winners of 2020, but a lot of them have really awkwardly written dialogue, and it's very frustrating to read. The characters were pretty one-dimensional as well, so I really wanted that creepy, gothic atmosphere, and it just didn't deliver for me. There were descriptions of creepy things that were happening or things that looked creepy, but they didn't make me feel anything. I would compare it to Home Before Dark, which is one that I read recently, and that one had great atmosphere and made me repeatedly look over my shoulder while I was reading it because I was just feeling so creeped out by the atmosphere and the creepiness and the eeriness. This book didn't do that for me whatsoever. Overall, I just felt it was super disappointing. It was not particularly scary. There is some gruesome body horror, which I would caution you about. Definitely not particularly scary, but there are moments that are gross for sure. But it just didn't do anything for me. It didn't scare me. It didn't keep me hooked in any way. So of the other nominees, I have read a couple of them. So I have read The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. I've read Devolution by Max Brooks, Plain Bad Heroines by Emily M. Danforth, Lakewood by Megan Giddings, and Ring Shout by P. Jelly Clark. And all of those I enjoyed more than Mexican Gothic, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it. But Lakewood and Ring Shout both got 5 stars. They are definitely my 2 favorites from this list. Ring Shout by P. Jelly Clark would be my pick for the horror category. Next category is humor. I did not read the winner in the humor category because the author has previously expressed anti-choice views, which I vehemently disagree with. So I chose not to support them by reading their work or promoting it on my channel. The next category was nonfiction, and the winner with 43,000 plus votes was Stamped, Racism, Anti-Racism, and You by Jason Reynolds and Ibram X. Kendi. This is a not history book, but it's a history book that follows the development of racism as a concept and also the racist system in America from the 1600s through to the present day. And this is a condensed and simplified version of Ibram X. Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning that was adapted by Jason Reynolds, and it's aimed at a young adult audience. I thought that this book was incredibly well done. It is so informative, and because it's a simplified version of a much more in-depth text, it has so much information packed into such a small package, and it is written in such a way that it is very approachable no matter how much you know or do not know about American history, about the history of racism on a global scale. This book meets you where you're at. And as a Canadian who is not particularly well-versed in history in general, but especially American history. This book made it so easy to follow and to really understand the complex systems in place and the impact of these different historical figures who I hear mention of in other books that I read about race in America, and gives so much more detail into who they were as people and their impact on various movements and on how the system evolved over time. So I thought this was great. I would highly recommend it. The only other nominee I read in this category was Me and White Supremacy by Layla F. Saad, which I would also highly recommend. I gave that one 5 stars as well. The next category is Memoir and Autobiography, and the winner with 81,000 votes was A Promised Land by Barack Obama. This book is Barack Obama reflecting on his first term as president of the United States in excruciating detail. I think this could be very, very fascinating for those who are particularly interested in the inner workings of politics. As a non-American who is interested in politics, but not necessarily in the minutiae of politics, I definitely felt that this dragged from time to time, especially not having the context, not being American. The intricacies of passing different bills and having little blurbs about different members of parliament or members of his team weren't the most intriguing for me as a reader. I definitely started to find myself skimming over certain parts, but there were definitely moments that really stood out to me that I really enjoyed, especially any and all moments he reflected on how his presidency impacted his wife and kids. If you want more of that, I would recommend Michelle Obama's memoir, Becoming, which was incredible, and I read that earlier in 2020. But those moments really touched me. They felt very reflective and humble and vulnerable on Obama's part. I also found, especially the section talking about climate change and his work on climate action, very, very intriguing, especially as someone who is interested in fighting for the environment and aware and tries to be a good steward for the planet in the ways that I can. I found those sections very interesting to read. I think we all know at this point that Barack Obama has a lovely voice, so listening to the audiobook with his narration was just a wonderful experience. Very calming. The book is a bit long. I think it probably could have been edited down a bit, but I do understand kind of the purpose behind it and what he was trying to do with this and creating a historical document to be referred to, and for people who are studying politics or studying the history of America to have that firsthand account, which I think has value and is not something that I would necessarily choose to read outside of this challenge, knowing what the purpose of it was. But despite the fact that I don't think I'm really the audience for this necessarily, I did enjoy it. I learned a lot. It gave me some insight into how the American political system works in many different ways. I haven't read any of the other books in this category, so I can't say if any of the other ones deserved to win, but I thought A Promised Land was very well done. The next category is History and Biography, and the winner with 45,000 votes, almost 46,000 votes, was Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents by Isabel Wilkerson. And in this book, Wilkerson compares the American system to the caste system in India and also the modified caste system that existed in Nazi Germany, and uses those comparisons to exemplify why the American system is in fact a caste system and what that tells us and teaches us about racism in the United States, both in the past and today. So this book was incredibly informative. Going into this, my knowledge of caste systems was relatively surface level, and I found the comparison between the caste system in India and Nazi Germany and the American system incredibly enlightening. This book is very well written and well organized. It is chock full of information. It's really shifted my perspective on how the American system functions and developed over time. This is definitely a book that every American should be reading, and anyone whose life is impacted by America and how their system functions, which is most of us in the world to some extent. This was just so eye-opening, and I am honestly a bit in awe of Isabel Wilkerson and her mind, because the parallels she draws are so apt and revealing. I listened to the audiobook, and I'm so glad I did because the narrator is Robin Miles, who narrates the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin, and she is quickly becoming one of my favorite narrators of all time. She has such a silky voice. She's wonderful. I had to pause a million different times to type out notes on what was being shared. I think I'll probably end up buying a physical copy so that I can highlight it and take copious notes in the margins, because this is just one of those books that can completely shift your worldview in such a fundamental way. And everybody should read it. That's what I have to say. It was incredible. The next category is science and technology, and the winner with 35,000 plus votes was A Life on Our Planet, My Witness Statement and a Vision for the Future by David Attenborough and Johnny Hughes. So this is a relatively short book where David Attenborough is reminiscing on his career and his impression of how global warming has progressed through his career, and uses what he's learned about projections for the future if we don't make significant change, as well as including recommendations to kind of give us hope for the future. So I loved this. I listened to the audiobook of this one as well. It's narrated by the author, David Attenborough. He is another one with a wonderful voice. I feel like I hit the jackpot on these last couple. Barack Obama, Robin Miles, and David Attenborough all have wonderful voices for audiobooks. And what I liked about this is that this is a really terrifying subject. Climate change and the risk of our destruction as a species is horrifying. And understandably, a lot of people shy away from learning more about it because it's bone chilling. You know, humans have a natural instinct to protect ourselves, you know, that self-preservation. And it's not just from physical threats, but it's also from psychological threats. And the psychological threat of confronting climate change on the scale that we're facing it is significant. And human brains want to run away. And I understand that. I feel the same. So what I loved about this is that while it does drop the facts, and the facts are bleak, it's also framed in a way that says, okay, this is what could happen if we continue the way we're going. Look at it in the face now. Here's what we can do. Here are steps we can take. This is how we can carve out a better future for ourselves. And it kind of feels like David Attenborough has you by the hand and is reassuring you and taking you through the process and saying, I know it looks scary now, but if we come together, we can do something. And that uplifting reassurance, that feeling of hope at the end was really inspiring. I'm getting emotional now, apparently. Sorry. Because it's scary and we need to come together. And I think a book like this, which is quite short, quite digestible, it is written in such a way that you don't have to be a scientist to understand it, but it lays out in very plain terms how bad it's going to get if we don't do something. And then it helps us to feel empowered to be able to take those steps to do something, to change the outcome. And I think that that's really powerful. I think it is much needed. And I highly recommend this book. I only read one of the other nominations in this category, which was Vesper Flights by Helen MacDonald. And this is one that I loved. This is a collection of essays, and I gave it 5 stars. I thought it was so beautifully done. And that one also has not solely a focus on climate change, but does touch on climate change as one of its major themes. So I would highly recommend that one as well. But I do think that this book by David Attenborough has more of a direct, focused impact on something that is so impending with doom that I think this one was well deserved of the win. And I really hope that it encourages a lot more people to read it. But if you're looking for more nonfiction, science and technology type books, I highly recommend Vesper Flights because it's wonderful. So the next category is cookbooks and food. And I did not read the winner because it felt weird to read a cookbook as part of this challenge. The next category is graphic novels and comics, and unfortunately, I did not read this one either. I was actually really intrigued and I wanted to read it. The winner in this category with 44,000 votes was Heartstopper. Unfortunately, this is the 3rd volume in the series, and I kind of made a rule at the start that I wasn't going to read anything that wasn't the first in the series. So even though I was really interested in this one, I had to skip it, though I am hoping to get my hands on the 1st volume soon so that I can read the series because I hear really good things about it. The next category is poetry, and the winner with almost 23,000 votes was Dearly, New Poems by Margaret Atwood. And unfortunately, this one didn't really do it for me. I kind of suspected that would be the case going into it because Margaret Atwood and me don't seem to get along. I read The Handmaid's Tale back in high school and very much disliked it. And then I tried to read Oryx and Crake back in 2020 and had to DNF it. Was not working for me. So I was a bit worried about it. And unfortunately, I was proven correct. There were a handful of poems in this collection that I liked, but none blew me away. And the vast majority I either didn't get or just made me feel nothing. And that's that. So unfortunately, this one didn't work for me. I haven't read any of the other poetry collections that are in the nominations, but I do have a couple of them on my TBR, and hopefully I like those more than I liked Dearly. So the next category is debut novel, and the winner with 52,000 plus votes was Such a Fun Age by Kiley Reid. And unfortunately, this one also didn't work for me. This is the story of our main character, who is a Black girl in her 20s living in the city, and she's a babysitter for a wealthy white family. And an event happens at a grocery store where she is sort of accused of having kidnapped the child that she babysits. And that's the inciting incident leading to the rest of the story that interrogates the racism of two of the white people in her life, both the mother of the young girl she babysits and her white boyfriend. I was really disappointed here because I see what this was trying to do, and I think it is so valuable to explore the racism in these microaggressions, and especially in people who see themselves as liberal, who see themselves as incredibly progressive and woke, and how they can still have these harmful views and they can still perpetrate microaggressions against people of color, and how that impacts the people of color, and in this case, specifically the Black people in their lives or in their vicinity. I feel like this is a lot less explored than more overt racism in literature, and I think it's important. But unfortunately, I just didn't jive with how this one was done. The characters felt very one-dimensional, and I struggled to connect to them. I found them all very unlikable, both the ones who are supposed to be unlikable and also the ones who I'm supposed to like. The only character I liked was the little girl, who was kind of sassy and fun. And I would direct you towards some Own Voices reviews that have brought up some concerns about the way that the Black characters and the non-Black people of color are portrayed in this story. There have been some questions of whether they are stereotyped and if the representation there is harmful. Obviously, I am not the person to decide that one way or the other, but I did feel a little weird about how some of the characters of color were portrayed at varying times throughout the story. The two woke white characters who we were looking at and seeing how they perpetrate racism and microaggressions in their life were very stereotypical and extreme, to the point that it was really hard to see them as real human beings. And I think that this was the biggest drawback for me, because I think that a book like this could do a lot of good by making especially young white girl boss type people who see themselves as woke and progressive and liberal and as allies to be able to see the ways in which they continue to perpetrate harmful stereotypes or harmful behavior and uphold white supremacy in their day-to-day lives. I think that there's a lot to be learned there, and I think that the character of Alex in this book could have been such a great conduit for those types of people to see themselves and to reevaluate some of their beliefs and actions. And there were little moments and glimmers here and there where I think Alex could have been effective in that, but her characterization and the things she chose to do were so extreme that I think anyone reading it, even people who do share a lot of common traits with Alex, would distance themselves from her, because she is a stalker essentially and goes so far in so many ways and crosses so many lines and is so extreme that I don't think anyone would be able to see themselves in her or be willing to see themselves in her. So I think if she had been portrayed in a bit of a more realistic way and toned down a little more, a lot more people would have been able to see themselves in her and then be able to use her situation and her choices and how those kind of play out to do more self-reflection and realize ways that maybe they are perpetrating harm without intending to. So that was kind of my major issue with this one, and that's just my opinion. A lot of people really love this. I'm happy that this worked for a lot of people. I just found Amira, our main character, was too flat and one-dimensional to really get to know her and root for her, and all of the other characters were so extreme and unlikable that I just kind of felt lost and couldn't find a reason to keep reading and was constantly cringing by what was happening. The execution just fell through for me. The next category is young adult fiction, and the winner with almost 40,000 votes is Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo. And it follows two young girls in the wake of a deadly plane crash. So I'm still processing this one, and I'm on the fence because on the one hand, I think this was so beautifully written. The prose is gorgeous. I think the message is really beautiful, and there were moments that were incredibly touching. But on the other hand, it just felt like it was lacking something, and I'm not sure what that is. It's possible that it's just that I'm not the audience for this. I am not a young adult. I'm not really sure. I will say, for me, the characters just didn't feel as well developed as I would like. I am such a character-driven reader, and I really want to connect to my characters deeply and know who they are as people and feel like I see them on a human-to-human level. And I struggled for most of the book to be able to differentiate between our two protagonists. And each one just felt a little too much like a shell and not enough like a fully fledged human being for my personal tastes. But again, not everyone looks for the same things in novels, and this was so well written. And like I said, had some really beautiful moments. So I've given it 3 stars. I feel complicated feelings about it. I would love to know your thoughts. If you've read Clap When You Land, I would love to hear different perspectives. I'm still clearly feeling very conflicted, and my feelings may change over time with more reflection. But where I'm at right now, I'm sitting at a 3-star read. The only other book I've read of the nominees was Felix Ever After by Case and Callender, which I gave 4 stars. I definitely was more impacted emotionally by Felix Ever After, so that would be my vote in this category. The next category is young adult fantasy, and I did not read the winner in this category for the same reason as graphic novels. This was, I believe, the 5th book in this series. So the winner with almost 63,000 votes was The Queen of Nothing by Holly Black. And I didn't read it, so I don't know if it was a worthy winner. I did read 2 of the other books that were nominated, though, The Extraordinaries by T.J. Klune and Raybearer by Jordan Afueco. And y'all know Raybearer was one of my favorite books of 2020. Fantastic read. The Extraordinaries I liked as well, but Raybearer, incredible. Next category is middle grade and children's, and the winner with almost 50,000 votes was The Tower of Nero by Rick Riordan. And this is another one that I didn't read. Unfortunately, this was later on in a series. I think this one was the 3rd or the 5th in a series. And I haven't read any of the other nominations in this category because I don't typically read middle grade or children's books. So the last category is picture books, and the winner with 28,000 votes is Antiracist Baby by Ibram X. Kendi. And this is a very short picture book for very young children explaining the basics of anti-racism as a tool for parents to be able to start to teach their kids from an early age. And I didn't rate this one because, as I said in my Goodreads review, I don't have kids. I don't work with kids in the age range that this is aimed towards. So I really don't have the context to know if this book is written in such a way that it would be effective for its mission. So it feels kind of unnecessary for me to add my rating in with people who maybe have more context to whether this would actually be helpful or not. So it seemed pretty straightforward and concise. But again, I'm not a parent of a young child, so I do not know if this would be appropriate for the age range it's targeting, if it would be helpful or not. So those are all the winners for the Goodreads Choice Awards 2020. I would love to know your thoughts in the comments down below. If you've read any of the winners, what did you think? If you've read some of the other nominees, what did you think? Please leave it down below in the comments. I'm really curious. This was quite the experiment. I'm not sure if I'll ever do it again, or at least not within a single month, because it was a lot. And I've been filming already for 2 hours, so hopefully it's shorter than that for you now that you're watching. So now, very quickly, I'm going to talk about the other books I read in January, because as I said, I did read a couple other books outside of this challenge. So the first one was The Night Swim by Megan Goldin, and this one was nominated in the mystery thriller category. So this is sort of a true crime podcast / courtroom drama where there's been a crime and a podcaster has traveled to this town to do live coverage of the trial. And I struggled with this one. I have mixed feelings. On the one hand, I enjoyed the courtroom drama aspect of it. I enjoyed the podcast element, especially listening to it as an audiobook. I felt that was pretty effective. I don't personally listen to true crime podcasts, nor do I read true crime or watch movies about true crime. It's just not something I'm interested in. So while I found those aspects interesting as a convention, as something that I don't normally see in the books that I read, I don't think it was enough to make me really enjoy this book, because that's just not something that I'm particularly into. And I honestly kind of feel similarly in the case of this book as I do to real life true crime, which is basically that I don't particularly like it because it feels exploitative. I don't love the idea of kind of making entertainment out of real life crimes where there are real victims involved. And especially for more modern day crimes where the victims could still be alive or their family are still alive and able to see this entertainment made out of their tragedy and their pain and their loss. It feels very weird to me. And it's something that I choose not to consume because I don't agree with it. And I personally know someone who has been harmed by true crime entertainment being made out of their loss. And it's a really painful experience for victims and their families and their loved ones. I think when reporting travels into the land of entertainment when it comes to true crime, there is a very fine line to walk to not be disrespectful to families and loved ones and victims. And that line is crossed far too much and it hurts people. So this book brought up a lot of my feelings about that. I'm going to put a bit of a trigger warning here. I'm going to talk a little bit about sexual assault here, not in detail, but I'm going to talk about the way that it was portrayed in this book. So you can skip to the next one if you don't want to hear about that. But the way that the sexual assaults were written in this were seemingly for shock value and were very gratuitous, and it read like trauma porn, and it was very uncomfortable and felt so unnecessary. You can tell a story about rape culture and victim blaming, slut shaming, consent, double standards, and the re-traumatization of victims when pursuing justice without sensationalizing the violence itself and making the violence entertainment. It really didn't sit well with me. And in my Goodreads review, I recommended that if you're looking for something that explores these issues, to read Know My Name by Chanel Miller, which is a memoir. It is nonfiction, and she is talking about her own experience of sexual assault and her experience of re-traumatization through the justice system and a lot of the other major themes from this book. But it's coming from a real person, a real victim, and there's no sensationalizing, there's no exploitation of the assault. It's done in a respectful way because it's written by the victim herself, and she is being respectful to her own needs. It's hard because I know that different people deal with their trauma differently, and some people may read this and see themselves in it and find it comforting or feel seen by it. But for me, those really detailed descriptions of the violence were just uncalled for and really inappropriate. The next thing I read in January that wasn't part of my challenge was actually an audiobook trilogy that I got from NetGalley for review. So this was the Steal Like an Artist trilogy by artist Kleon. And the first one especially, Steal Like an Artist, was really famous when it first came out. And I guess they decided to create an audiobook version of all three together. So I enjoyed this as an artist, as a creative human being. They're basically framed as a bunch of little anecdotes, little pithy pieces of advice. Some of them I found helpful and interesting and, worth writing down. A lot of them were things that I've heard and, nothing particularly new or exciting. So I ended up giving the trilogy 3 stars. I thought it was interesting. I think it's worth a listen if you are in a creative field, if you're an artist online. For me specifically, the third in the trilogy, Keep Going, was the most relevant and the one that I found myself writing the most notes about. It was definitely the most impactful impactful for me out of the three. I will say that there is an occurrence of the inappropriate use of the word schizophrenic outside of its medical context, which really shocked me, and I hope will be removed because it is not the correct usage of the word and reinforces negative stereotypes about people with schizophrenia. So that really shocked me. I had to take a break for a couple days after that to continue to listen. And I wrote a note to the publisher along with my review asking them to look into that because I don't believe that that's something that should be included. So I wanted to put that out there. If you're thinking about listening or reading this, that is included and could be offensive to someone reading. The next book I read outside of the challenge was Home Before Dark by Riley Sager, which I mentioned in the mystery thriller section as well. This is the one that I would have picked as my favorite because it was my favorite out of the ones that I read that were nominated. The concept of this is that our main character's father wrote a book about their experience when she was young, living in this old creepy house, and the paranormal experiences he says they had while they were there. And he's passed away and left the house to his daughter, and she's going back for the first time since she was young. And she doesn't really remember being there, and she doesn't believe that her father's book is accurate. She thinks he made it up to sell more copies. And she's moved into this house, and then creepy things start happening, and she starts questioning whether the book was truth or fiction. And what I really liked about this book was that it kind of had dual timelines between her rereading the book, so we get the father's perspective in first person as he wrote the book, so it has a book within a book, and then the current day timeline that she's living in the house now. I will say that the past timeline, the book within a book, was a lot more up my alley, a lot more my speed, a lot more atmosphere, a lot more intriguing and fast-paced than the modern day timeline. The modern day timeline didn't do it as much for me. The main character was a little bit one-dimensional, and there just wasn't as much happening. And there certainly wasn't as much tension and eeriness. As I mentioned earlier, what I really liked about this was that creepy Gothic house tension. I was looking over my shoulder constantly while listening to the audiobook of this one, especially in those book within a book sections. I will say the reason I gave it 4 stars instead of 5 was that the ending was a letdown for me. It was fine, I guess. It just didn't go the way I wanted it to go. It didn't go the way I thought it was going to. And I just felt it was kind of the boring choice, I guess. The other thing I want to mention, which I guess kind of ties into the main character being a cardboard cutout, is that Riley Sager is a male author. And he specifically chose at one point in his career to stop writing under his legal name and create a pen name to write under. And he specifically chose an ambiguous name so that it wouldn't be immediately obvious if he was a woman or not. And he writes seemingly under this new name, Riley Sager, exclusively female main characters. And all of the books of his that I've read, those main characters are pretty one-dimensional. This is a larger conversation, and this video is already so long that I'm not going to really get into it. But I do struggle with the idea of male authors taking on ambiguous or feminine-sounding names to write under, and then choosing to write female protagonists and aiming their books at a female audience. There's something duplicitous about that gets under my skin. And Riley Sager is not the only one, and he's also not the worst one. There are male authors who are taking on names that are decidedly feminine and kind of masquerading as women. And we have enough of an issue with representation of women in literature and women authors that this really rubs me the wrong way. If you were going to write a female main character as a male author, you need to do your research and you need to do a good job of portraying a real human being who happens to be a woman. I have an issue with men basically trying to trick women into reading their books by making themselves seem like they could be women and writing books about women, but then not doing the actual work to write complex, interesting, fully developed female characters. That to me seems like exploitation of women for your personal gain, and I don't like that. So I personally have an issue with that. I am not planning on reading anything else from Riley Sager or from any other author who participates in this kind of behavior because it doesn't sit well with me. So, okay, so the last book, this is the last one I read in January that was outside of my reading challenge. And this was The Survival of Molly Southbourne by Tade Thompson. This was the second novella in a little duology that is a horror duology. I talked about the first one back when I read it. I don't remember what month, but I'll link it down below. And I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the sequel as well. I thought it was very interesting. There's a lot of body horror and gore. It's pretty gross, but there's a really interesting exploration of identity and the definition of self and what makes one human, but not only just human, but what makes one an individual? What makes you you? What is you? What is your consciousness? What is your soul? Do you have those things? Does it matter? There are also some other themes in this sequel that have to do with belonging and love and mental health and mental illness that were welcome additions as well. I think that these are great little books that are very well written, and if you are able to handle body horror and gore, I would highly recommend. Now that I've finally finished talking about all the books I read in January, here are my January stats. I'm not going to talk through them in depth because this video is already long enough, but here are some pretty graphs showing what my reading looked like for the month of January. Oh my goodness, I'm losing my voice. So now let's briefly, very briefly, talk about my reading plans for February. So as you'll know, February is Black History Month in both the US and Canada. I don't know how many other countries it is, but I know for the country I live in, it is Black History Month. So my plan for February is to read a bunch of books written by Black authors. I always try to do that, but especially in February, that's going to be my main goal. And I have so many books on my TBR that I have been requesting from my library or getting Kindle versions of. So I'll put up on the screen a bunch of the covers of the books that I have on my short list. My basic plan for February is after January and having so many books that I had to read to be part of this challenge, I wanted to do something a little more laid back for February. So I'm not giving myself a really strict TBR, but I have selected a bunch of books that I would like to read, and I'm just going to kind of mood read from within those and maybe a couple from outside, but trying to stick within these because they are the ones I currently have available to me, and obviously trying to focus on Black authors for February. So that's kind of my plan. And then also our book club selection for February. We wanted to read a queer romance for February with Valentine's Day. So we're reading The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune, which is a super popular book right now. It is very hyped. I'm really excited to read it. It's been on my TBR for a while. So yes, those are my February plans. A whole lot of Black literature. I'm really excited about that. And I might try to participate in a couple readathons that are happening this month. But as I said, after January, it was a lot to get through that challenge. And I'm trying to be a little easier on myself and allow myself to mood read a little more. So I probably won't strictly adhere to any particular readathon, but I'll put some links to a couple of them that are happening in February in the description box if you want to check them out. And we'll see if I end up actually reading books that fit into the prompts for these readathons anyway. But I don't want to overly pressure myself. I just want to read books that are going to enrich my life and that I'm going to enjoy. So that is this video. It's a monster. I'm not looking forward to editing this tomorrow, but I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching as always. And as always, let me know down below, what's your favorite book you read in January? What are your thoughts on the books that I talked about in this video? And what are your plans for reading in February? Is there a book you're really looking forward to? And of course, as always, if you have any recommendations, drop them down below. So I'm going to get going. Thank you so much for watching this one, and I'll see you really soon in my next one. Bye, friends. Before I go, I want to take a moment to thank my patrons for their support. Extra special thanks to our newest patrons, Jeremy, Monique, Ciara, Christiana, Annette, Jessica, Catherine, Gia, Brittany, and Daniela. Welcome all of you to the squad. We are so excited to have you. If you at home want to join the squad, feel free. There's a link in the card and in the description box down below. And if you're looking for something else to watch, I recommend checking out some of my recent videos around my face.